Let's move on to CSS Columns. You can see I've got Visual Studio Code open here with just an empty frame of a page. Once again, I've got the title of CSS Columns, nothing in the body of the HTML at this point. And if we look at the style.css, you can see I'm once again importing in the Roboto font from the Google Fonts. And then I also have a couple of styles on the body. We're applying the Roboto font with the font family, and we've set the font size to 1.5 rem. And that's it so far. So let's go back to the HTML. And the first thing I want to do is create 5 paragraphs. So I'm going to use an Emmet abbreviation. I'll type P times 5, and then I'll just say lorem 20 and press tab, and we should have 5 paragraphs now. So I'll save that much. I'll go ahead and press Control B so we can see a little more. I'm not going to wrap the lines, as it would just clutter and of course wrap each one of these lines down just a little bit. I don't need to do that right now. What I do want to do now is add a section that will be a container for the first 4 paragraphs. So we'll take this section, and after the 4th paragraph, we'll put the closing element right there, the closing tag, and we can save. It didn't auto format for me, so I'm going to select these and press tab so it comes over. And now I've got the first 4 paragraphs inside of this section element as a container, and then the final paragraph is outside of the section element. And I'm also going to apply a class here. Let's call this class Columns. I want it inside the quotes. And now we're finished with the basic HTML so far. So now let's move on to the CSS. I'll click the file tree again, go to style.css. Now, with all of this saved, I guess we could quickly look at it in the browser, and we just see our 5 paragraphs over here. So we're going to make some changes now, and I'll drag VS Code back over to fill the full screen as we apply the columns. Okay, let's create our columns class. So dot columns, and inside this class I'm going to set a column dash count, and let's set it to 4 columns so far and save. And now let's go look at our code or our browser, and look what we have here in the browser. Now I've spread it out a little bit, so the first 4 paragraphs are in 4 columns, and we can see of course this 5th paragraph that's not inside of that section element that has the class columns is not split into columns at all, but it automatically split the first 4, and just as it would resize here, as luck would have it with the browser, there's actually 1 paragraph per column right now. However, I'm going to right click and choose Inspect so we can open DevTools and resize this, and notice what happens here. We can scrunch it down, and now it's not necessarily 1 paragraph per column. It just adapts to whatever the screen size is. Now we can change this as well. So I'm going to go back to VS Code, and then we'll make a change here. Instead of this column count being just 4, let's go ahead and add a column width as well. So let's tell it that our column width should essentially never be less than 250 pixels per column. So that should change things a little bit. Now you can see we only have 2 columns. Even though we told it 4, it's going to adhere to that width and never go below that. Now, once it can support 3 columns of 250 pixels, then it switches to 3, and it will go up to 4 columns if that's available to it. However, if not, it will stick with 3. Let me see if I can squeeze this just a little more to get all 4 columns to show. Now we're back to our 4 columns, but as we resize the browser width, it only supports what it can for the 250 pixels. And once it can't support that, it should condense down to just 1 column. So that makes it very flexible as far as the design goes, because if it can only support 1 column, it will never make it smaller than that 250 pixels we set. But if it can support 2, it does, all the way up to the column number that we specified, which was 4. I'm going to pull VS Code back up, and there's shorthand for this, so we don't always have to type column-count and column-width. We can just say columns, and there we could specify 4 250 pixels, and it would be the same. So I'm going to comment these out, And now save, and we shouldn't really see any changes in our page because that should mean the same thing, just in shorthand. We can also provide dividers. So this would be with the column-rule property, and here we can say we want 3 pixels, and I'll press Control B to hide the file tree so we can see all of this, but 3 pixels, let's say solid. And now let's just give some kind of color here. I'll just go with that flat black and save. And notice this column rule is just like when we provide a border, and the values go in the same order. So when I have provided a border in the past around any kind of element, you have seen the size and then the type of border and then the color. And that's the same for the column rule. Now let's see what it does to our page. And here we see the rules between each column now. And of course, they will disappear when the columns disappear if the sizing dictates that. And so once we get down to one column, even though we've said column rule should exist, it won't if there's only one column. But if there are columns to separate, that's when the column rules start to show up. And this will once again divide up to how many columns we've created. So if we say a max of 4 columns, we could have up to 3 column rules. And we can also provide some spacing between those columns. So let's say column -gap, and I'm going to choose a larger value so we definitely see the spacing, so 3 rems, and let's see how that spaced everything out. Now we only have 3 columns because we have some extra spacing, so it wouldn't fit into the 4 columns as before, but it does look a little bit better with that extra spacing between the columns. And with DevTools open, now is a good time to draw your attention to a problem that exists right here. I'll squeeze this over so we can see a little more, and I want to pull this down so we can see some of the HTML above. Now, as we get into our columns section, and you can see it highlighted on the page as I highlight the elements here in DevTools, notice we have margin at the top and the bottom of each paragraph. We didn't use a CSS reset so far, so those margins have not been set to 0. And that's okay, we want spacing between the paragraphs. But notice here in this first paragraph, we also have spacing above the first paragraph. So it's not setting flush with the top as the other columns are. And then as we come down, notice each paragraph is going to have its own top and bottom margin. But there's one thing to consider here. We need to remove that top margin from the first paragraph. But let's see if we can just remove it from all of the paragraphs and what happens. Notice our margin spacing between the paragraphs, as we see between the first and the second, for example, just is the spacing for that one margin essentially. So here we see it again between the third and the second, we just see that top spacing, but if I highlight the second, we just see the bottom spacing, and they seem to overlap. Let's also discuss what's going on there. So we'll go back to the code, and I'm going to set another rule here, and we want to say just our paragraphs that are inside the columns container. So we'll say the columns class and then P, and let's say margin-top, and set that to 0 and save. Now we go back to the browser, and our first paragraph is flush at the top with the others. But notice our spacing between the paragraphs did not change. And that's a good thing. It automatically happens in CSS. And I don't believe I've discussed this before, but that is margin collapsing. So it's not going to double up the margin between the second and the third paragraph just based on having a bottom margin on, say, the first one and a top margin on the second one. However, now we've removed that top margin, but the spacing remained the same. But previously it wasn't twice as much because of margin collapsing. So that's a good thing, and it's worth noting. So we can actually just remove the top margin from each paragraph and not change the spacing of the others, but it does fix the top alignment here, making it flush with the other columns as we want it to. Now let's go back to our HTML and add another element inside of this file. So we have a couple of paragraphs inside of our columns container. Now let's add an H2. And inside the H2, let's just say next topic, just some kind of generic header here. And we can save that. Now let's go to our style CSS, and let's go ahead and style that header as well. We'll once again be specific, so we'll say columns and then any H2 inside of our columns container. Let's set the margin top to 0, just like we did for the paragraph, so there's not an issue there. Let's set the background color to that flat black, 333, and then let's set the color to white, which is FFF as far as hexadecimal code goes. Then we can provide some padding, let's say 1 rem, and let's save, and let's take a look now at our web page, and we have our next topic right here, but let's see what happens as we resize. That looks a little weird. We have part of the padding at the top of the second column, and the rest of the header here at the bottom of the first column. That's kind of strange. We might not want that. Let's get some more room and drag it over and see if anything else weird happens. Well, not with the room we have, but as this resizing occurs, strange things could happen. But we can prevent some of those strange things by applying another property inside of our H2. So now let's say break dash inside, and we'll say avoid. We'll save that, come back to the page, and now as we get to our 2 columns, we notice it's on the second column, which may not be the best thing that we want. We might want that at the top of the second column, but it's not splitting the header into 2 different pieces with part of it at the top and then part of it to the right. And once we get down to 1 column, it's just the 1 header there. Now we can apply one other property. Let's bring VS Code back up, and here we could say break dash before, and we'll set this to column. And there's good and bad with this, so let's look at this overall. So now notice we're at the top of the second column, and that's fine. And as we scroll and we have 2 columns, now we're at the top of the second column again, which is what we want, instead of being at the bottom of this second column as we were before. The problem comes when we want to size down to 1 column. Notice what happens. Instead, everything shrinks and we got 3 columns. And that's not maybe what you would expect, but this break before actually forces a column break, so it forces there to be more than 1 column, and the browser is trying to fit all of that in, which is why it shrinks. So probably not a great idea to use this break before column property if you know you're going to be shrinking your page down to that 1 column. However, the break inside with the avoid will keep your header that you might create or something else from being split between the 2 columns. Now let's go back to our HTML. And here's the HTML file. I'm going to remove this header for now. I'll leave it in the code so you can see it there, but we've just commented it out. But what I do want to provide is a quote. So let's provide a quote that we would have, maybe something we would be highlighting on the page. So here's one more paragraph, and inside this paragraph I'm going to say, "Where's my rug?" and then man, which is of course from the movie The Big Lebowski. And then we can say that was from the dude who is the author of that quote. Now let's provide some things here that will make this stand out a little more. So we can say class equals quote, and we'll style this class. And here, let's go ahead and fill the page right now as we see this code so we can see the full quote here. But then there's some other things we want to apply as well. So I'll save this much, and actually, just as I filled the page, I want to go back to the browser. And now on the browser, we'll go ahead and open up this page. It's unicode-table.com, and it lets us look up other characters like HTML entities that you may have learned about when you were going through my HTML course or one like it. But there's also Unicode characters, and there's different ways to provide these different characters. So it says popular character sets. We want quotation marks, kind of the fancy ones. So let's just go to this page full of quotation marks, and you can see we want these opening quotation marks right here. The left one, I'll click on that. It gives us several different codes we can use in our page. So here's the HTML code for this opening quotation mark. There's also an HTML entity here, so we could probably use either one. I'm just going to select this ampersand # 8220 and the semicolon, and that's going to be our opening quotation mark. So I'll pull Visual Studio Code back up, and inside of our quote right here, it looks like I've got an extra quotation mark there for the class. Okay, our class quote is correct. Now I'm going to paste in that code, and now we should have that opening quotation mark here to go along with our quote. Likewise, if we go back to the page, you can see they're saying with this symbol these are often used. Let's click on this other quotation mark, and oh, it just took us back to quotation marks. So here was the opening one. Now let's get the closing one. So we'll click on this, scroll down, and as you might have guessed, it's just the next number. Instead of 8220, it's 8221. I'll go ahead and select all of that again. We'll go back to VS Code, and inside of VS Code, I'm going to expand this just a little bit so we can get to the end of the quote. And after that, we have got this wrapped in these fancy quotes with this HTML character that is kind of like an HTML entity, but it's also kind of Unicode in a way. And this is just another way HTML handles these characters, and we can put this in to wrap the quotes. And there's many other symbols you could use and find on this website. And one of those symbols that we want to put right here beside our author is a long hyphen. So let's see if we can search for that above. I'll type in long hyphen, and we'll see what comes up. Well, there's the hyphen minus, soft minus, not seeing it right now. Well, maybe this one, maybe not, but I know what the code is, so let me see if I can just search for that and it will come up. It's 8212, and here we've got the EM dash is what it's called. I wanted to call it a long hyphen, and there was a copy right there in the search results, but I'm just going to once again get the code here from the HTML code. And this again is called an EM dash. So we'll go back to our Visual Studio Code, HTML code. I'm going to put that right before the dude, so we'll have that longer dash or hyphen before the author is attributed. And now before we look at our HTML, or before we look at our web page, I'll save that and let's go to the style once again, and let's style this quote class. So we'll say quote actually, and then we'll apply several things here. So the first is a font dash size, and let's put 3 rem. Now let's put text align center because we want this quote centered. And now we can provide a color. Let's do something, we'll adjust this in a little bit. Let's do that flat black color again. And now for the main thing that we want to highlight here is the column span property, and we can say all. So this will span all of the columns that we have on the page. Okay, now let's go back and look at our web page, and we see our big quote, and it's spanning all 3 of the columns, and we have kind of our fancy quote symbols here that are wrapped around it as well, and we have our EM dash or long hyphen after, or actually before the author. And this is kind of like you might see in a magazine as well, where they highlight a quote as you're reading the article. But something doesn't look quite right, does it? We've got all this space underneath, but no space on top. That's because this is a paragraph that's inside of our section container. And remember, we set the margin top to 0 for all of those. So let's go back to our code. And now that we're inside of this quote class, let's set the margin dash top to 2 rem and go back and take a look. And I think you'll be surprised at what we see. There's absolutely no change. So what's going on? Well, let's once again look at our code and see the problem. What we have here is columns, the class columns, and then an element, columns P, where we set the margin top to 0. That is more specific than just having a class. So let's go ahead and look at our specificity calculator, and we can see how this is calculated. So I'll put our first one here at the top, and that is columns, which gives it a score of 10 as a class, and then P as an element. So it's got a score of 11. And as you might guess, if we were down here and just said quote, we only have a score of 10. So even though quote comes after this column's P definition in the cascade, it's not as specific, so that margin is not applying. What we could do is say dot columns dot quote, and then notice we have a score of 20, so that would work. Let's go back and apply that in our code, and I bet we see the margin change. So instead of just quote, we'll say columns quote save, go back to our page, and now we have a margin on top as expected. So there's another learning experience about specificity. Now let's resize the page a little bit, and we're going to see something else we might not like. I don't like how this breaks our author down to the next line. We've got the on one line with his long dash, and then dude on the second line. So we want to be able to control that break. We definitely don't want the long dash on the first line and then the author on the second. Eventually it kind of catches up, but those breaks in between aren't what we want, and we can fix that with CSS. Back in VS Code, let's go back to our HTML first, and let's wrap our author in a span element, which is an inline element. And let's give this a class equal to no wrap. And of course, now we'll need to take, I'm going to wrap the code here with Alt-Z, because we'll need to take this closing span and put it after dude right here. So now we can save that, and our HTML is taken care of. Now we just need to style our no wrap class. So underneath our columns quote, let's put no wrap. Inside of no wrap, we're going to use the white dash space property and set that to no wrap. And so now when we go back to our browser and we resize, our quote should not break the dude. Our author should always stay on the same line, including that long dash. And that's exactly what happened. It all went down to the second line at the same time. So we're no longer breaking the dude with his long dash into separate lines. And that's the way we want to style that. So overall, I hope this tutorial has helped you learn how to apply columns to your content on a web page the simple way, really without even using Flexbox or Grid, which will be covered in upcoming modules as well.